Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. I'm Mike Bowdendistel. I'm the head of intermodal solutions here at FreightWaves, and I'm joined by Joanna Marsh, as always. Joanna, looking forward to reading more of your articles. You've been putting a lot out lately on a variety of topics, but one of the main topics we're hitting home here is the Ohio derailment. By my count, we have about 6 articles up on FreightWaves.com, not including all of the content on FreightWaves TV about this particular topic. What's the latest?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's just a lot of good stuff out there. Rachel Premack with FreightWaves had written a piece just kind of looking at the maintenance issue of, what was sort of were there sort of preventative steps that could have been taken, like looking at maintenance, and I saw the interview that you and Rachel did today on FreightWaves Now, which I thought was just pretty good, kind of looking at as you mentioned, sort of, everyone's pointing the blame at Norfolk Southern, but what other factors are there that consider? So, check those 2 things out. And then, of course, the investigation is still ongoing with the NTSB, and the EPA is up there as well, and Norfolk Southern kind of addressing the community concerns. And it's interesting because I was looking at Twitter earlier, and just, I think one interesting aspect of this accident is that, you have the social media now that you might not have had, for instance, 10 years ago with Lac-Mégantic. So you have all this speculation, and also, information about what's out there, and what might have caused the derailment. So it's trying to look at the issue while also wading through all of that.
Yeah, I would say the social media aspect has not enhanced our ability to keep a calm head and wait for an investigation to take place and just sort of reserve judgment until we know more. That whole thing has really been sort of in your face. I mean, just even on Reddit, which I think is less toxic than a lot of the social media sites, it's like nonstop, derailment. How could the Norfolk Southern do this? But I think there's a lot to consider, and I do think the NTSB is going to get to the bottom of this. And for some perspective on this and some other topics, I want to introduce our guest, Herman Hackstein, who is the president of the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association. This is a trade organization comprised of a large number of food and beverage companies, including a lot of household name CPGs. Herman was the CEO of FHW Group up until a couple of years ago. That's the largest lessor of refrigerated rail cars. Herman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's always great to have someone with your level of expertise on FreightWaves. And, we were just chatting before the show about the derailment. I think it's on everyone's mind. And you had some interesting perspective on the wheel bearing issue with the heat generated by those wheel bearings and how often those are replaced. And then you also had some interesting perspective on the detectors that are located every 20 miles on that line. Could you share some of that insight with us?
So, it's like you said, social media, whatever it is, everybody's trying to get ahead of what's the cause, where's the smoking gun. And it's got to be very difficult for people like the NTSB to be doing their job and trying to look at all the facts. But from an industry person, we started talking about wheel bearings. Wheel bearings are a daily item. Wheel bearings on a rail car are probably the most regularly, wheel sets, axles, and wheel bearings are the most regularly addressed issue on a rail car. So it's a well-known fact in the rail industry that at that failure point needs to be detected well in advance. And for years, the railroads have deployed these independent sensors in the tracks that are very effective at detecting worn wheel sets, bad bearings, flat spots on wheels, et cetera. So I think there's probably a lot of focus behind the scenes going on right now as to when those detections were made, if those detections were made, were those detectors working properly? The influence of social media, right? So we're picking up Ring doorbell cameras. People are submitting, hey, it came through on my doorbell the other day. Look at this. And I picked it up on a totally non-related station. I saw some video that was posted by somebody that showed flames coming from the wheel, supposedly 40 miles away or 40 minutes away. I don't remember. So yeah, there's a lot of things to investigate, but certainly the technology for detecting these kinds of issues, it's available, and we're assuming it's working and in place. And I'm sure we'll find out from the folks on the ground that are investigating where the gap might be in that area.
Yeah, so it sounds like from talking to you that it was really a failure, not so much in the rail car, because these are regular issues that need to be addressed all the time. It's just our regular maintenance. It was the failure to detect the need for maintenance. And so who is responsible for making sure that detectors are functioning properly? I mean, who's detecting the detectors? Is that the railroad, or is that some third-party supplier?
No, I think the detectors have a direct feed with the train crews. So I'm not well enough versed to be able to tell you who's responsible for the maintenance or the upkeep of those detectors.
Got it. But you really appreciate your insight there. I think it seems like we're at least getting closer, and it is too early to speculate, I think, on exactly what happened. I think the NTSB is going to get to the bottom of this. Also, Herman, wanted to ask you, really the reason we had you on, there's so many issues with the private, rail cars. They're having all these service issues. You've done a number of times you've testified to various organizations, including Surface Transportation Board, to Congress, to other hearings regarding precision scheduled railroading. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of the type of points you made at those various hearings?
So I'll go back to, what is Private Railcar Food and Beverage Shippers Association? So we short name that PRFBA, and PRFBA is an organization of food and beverage companies that are large rail shippers, but in order to belong to the association, you have to also own or lease your own rail cars. So these are rail shippers that are committed to rail shipping. They have skin in the game. They have assets, very expensive assets, that they're putting in the hands of the railroad every day, and they need to be very engaged in the railroads to try to make sure that they get good usage of those assets, and that their service that's provided by the railroads is getting them the return on investment that they planned on getting from those assets. So we're about 20 of the biggest of the big, and by that I mean the largest industry players, whether it be in a beverage industry, an adult beverage industry, or a cereal industry. They've all joined us. So initially, we got together because we wanted to have a platform of benchmarking. I'm recently retired as a CEO of the MHW Group, and during that tenure, or part of that tenure, was managing our Crowdtrans rail business, which was a company that contract manufactured and leased refrigerated and insulated rail cars. So a lot of these guys were my customers in the olden days, and I still feel to some extent they're my customers today, because helping them get the efficiency out of the fleet that they deserve for the investment they made makes me feel good at the end of the day. So these guys are initially just looking for ways to talk with each other, benchmark best practices. How do we get better at rail? That started getting into, hey, how about we start getting like town hall style meetings with the big wigs at some of these railroads? Because now we're not just, one company that has 30 or 40,000 railcar shipments a year. Now we're like a large group of companies who have hundreds of thousands of shipments a year. Maybe they'll sit down and want to talk to us. So fireside chats, and then just by progression, you can understand that maybe that wasn't happening as well. So then we started talking to the Surface Transportation Board a little bit more, a lot more. And then eventually we hired a full-time lobbyist, and now we're trying to make our issues, I'll say, heard on Capitol Hill. So that's what's led to us testifying at the Surface Transportation Board hearings, testifying before Congress, which I did this spring when we were talking about railroad service failures. So does that answer your question, or where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, so it gives us a great sense of what you guys are doing and how you're helping those shippers. I guess from here, how would you describe rail service right now? We heard a lot about service issues the past 2 years. Rail traffic is kind of mixed, but down, in a lot of segments. Have you seen it gotten any better with, the Union Pacific lifting its embargoes and, just with the lower volume?
So volume is flat. I mean, intermodal volumes, well, you're the more the expert, I think, Mike, on it, but intermodal volume continues to be down, right? So, is service getting better? You know what? If you live in Maryland and it's cold every day when it's 30, 40 degrees outside, you say it's a beautiful day. If you were living in Florida and it's 30, 40 degrees, it's absolutely a horrible day. So it really depends on the perspective of what you're looking at. And service has been so bad since 2018 that I think people are just starting to accept not good service. So let me put it to you that way. So one of the things that the PERF organization has been spending a lot of time with Surface Transportation Board is trying to establish some kind of first mile, last mile reporting criteria so that we can actually identify, is service getting better? The railroads report wonderful statistics to the Surface Transportation Board today. Every week, their train speed and their dwell times and their terminal dwell, and they have all these wonderful statistics that absolutely add up to nothing. They mean not a darn thing to a shipper. Shipper wants to know is, did the load get picked up on time and did they get delivered on time? And we have that very, very much in the trucking industry, even to some extent in the intermodal industry, but we don't have it in the rail industry in general. So it'd be great to be able to answer your question, Mike, by being able to say, yeah, we were at 80 and now we're at 82 for on-time delivery, but we just don't have that kind of service metric in place with the railroads, and we really need to do that so that we can truly identify fact-based issues when you talk about service.
Yeah, it seems like you need to be able to measure it first of all, and I agree with you that the shipper probably doesn't care if the railroad is moving 15 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour. Does it get there? Does it get there on time or not? Is a better question. When shippers come to you and they want to incorporate rail into their network or are thinking about the balance between truck and rail, and you've always done a lot with box cars and refrigerated, box cars, which, that's competitive with truck. I mean, how do you think about incorporating rail into a supply chain if you're a supply chain manager?
So, I think that's I think every supply chain manager has to have diversity in his supply chain. I think he's got to be using barge if possible, but certainly intermodal, truck, and rail. And I think diversity helps you get through the tough times. I mean, everybody knows there just simply wasn't enough capacity to go around during the COVID, peak years. But the guys certainly that had more tools in the toolbox were able to get through it more successfully than others. So, but at the same time, there's other peoples that are, I would say, much more restricted. Like, we've heard a lot of news about the guy in the West Coast that has feed trains coming in. He's got to feed his chickens so that he can produce chicken products for his end customers. So, I mean, he needs a feed train at a time, 50 cars. I mean, that's 200 truckloads. I mean, his infrastructure, his ability to receive truck or switch to truck, it's just not realistic, right? Same thing with many of the other bulk materials, wheat, soybean, all that product naturally works well on rail. So if you're a supply chain guy and you're in a rice factory or a heavy soybean or industry, then you definitely have to have rail in your toolbox. If you're maybe a shoe store guy, you could probably get away with not having rail in your supply chain solution.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot that really sort of has to go on rail. It's a good perspective. Wanted to ask, you, Joanna, you just put out an article, featuring some of the comments from Herman on the Class 1 railroad shareholder base. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So Herman and I were chatting the other day about some of the research that he was looking into, looking at filings from the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, just kind of seeing the who are the investors of the railroads, and it was interesting. I thought, some of his findings, and I guess Herman, if you want to explain a little bit more about what you saw exactly, and what the significance of that might be.
Sure, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because it's become a little bit of the latest passion of our organization. So I'm just going to take 2 steps back and say, the organization, PERFA, many shippers are trying to figure out how do we influence the railroads? How do we work better with them? How do we get them to grow their business with us? Shippers want more rail capacity. Congress wants more rail capacity. The Department of Energy just produced a white paper that FreightWaves reported on a month or so ago. They want a bigger modal shift from truck to rail. So people want rail, and the question is, how do we influence the railroads to grow their business? Today, the railroads have had flat volume growth over the past, let's say, 4 or 5 years. They've had constant profit growth over that same period of time, but they've done so through pricing and reduction in costs. So they're growing their profit, but they're not growing their business. And we, the shippers and Congress, we need them to take on a larger amount of freight. So how do you do that? And we weren't being successful. And PERF is not the kind of organization that says, okay, the door's closed. We'll come back tomorrow when you're open. We have to try to find a way to get the door to open. And in this case, we wanted to look at, well, what influences the railroads and their decisions? How could we work with the railroads to make it make sense for them to do more business with shippers, and how do we influence that? So you look at the obvious things. We've spent some time with the Surface Transportation Board, and we spent some time with Congress, as you mentioned. We testified before Congress. We've knocked on a lot of doors, and the influence isn't necessarily hitting home. So I thought, well, maybe the influence might come from the investor community. And we were pretty surprised, at the results that we found. In the U.S., and we'll just focus on the U.S. 4 Class 1 railroads, you have the BNSF, the Union Pacific, the CSX, and the NS. So in 2010, the BNSF was purchased by the Hathaway Group, which Berkshire Hathaway, everybody knows that as Warren Buffett. And so those shares are controlled, that railroad is controlled by, we'll say, the direction of the single investor. Then you get down into the next level and you look at the next railroad, you look at the Union Pacific. And the Union Pacific's top 4 investors are the large institutional investors. We're talking Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and Geo Capital. Those companies combined have more than 21% of the voting power at the top end of that railroad. It would take the next 25 investors to just match their share. Now, we were talking before, FreightWaves and I were talking before, and say, yeah, so, I mean, was that bad or is that good? Well, it goes to, what would it take to influence a railroad? When the management and the board of a railroad make decisions, they put those decisions to vote, and those proxy votes are put out to the investors. Passive investors vote with the board. They list themselves as passive investors with the SEC. They are by nature board supporters. So the influence on the board is from within for at least that percentage of the votes. So in the case, again, we'll go back to Union Pacific, with 21% of the vote being automatically supportive of the board, And then you have the other folks, whether it's employees or executives, that are going to naturally vote with the board in order to overthrow their majority to get something to change. In other words, the board could pass a 20% pay raise for all executives, whether the board would do that or not, but they could put that out there. And the difficulty at being able to overthrow that kind of a business decision is very difficult when the top 20 or 25% of your investors are basically voting with you automatically. So the ability to influence, the ability to change, the ability to get the board to maybe look at things with a more open mind, or maybe from a Department of Energy's perspective, or maybe from a shipper's perspective, it's difficult, and apparently it's extremely difficult to try to get their investment community to help you with those kinds of, I'll say, requests or desires. The other interesting thing we continue to look at, which is, I don't know if it's scary, depending on the industries that you follow, but the next two Class 1 railroads, the CSX and the NS, both have the same top 4 passive investors in their top group of investors. So just try to, again, in English, both of their positions are 20% or greater in the NS or in the CSX, and that position again would outweigh the next largest group of investors by 25 to 30. So we have 4 institutional passive investment groups that are controlling such a large share of the railroad's voting stock. It's not a danger, as maybe the initial, it's like, hey, that's not an active investor, it's not going to throw it off track. Instead, it's an insulator. It's an influential insulator. Those guys are in it for the long term. They're not going to buy and sell. They're not going to make threats to the board. They're not going to they're trying to make a good long-term quiet investment. And the question is without the influence of the investors, or at least that large of a part of the investors, what's actually outside influences are actually out there to get the railroads to make some of the decisions that we, the shipper, Congress, or the STB, want them to make. So that's the challenge.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because it seems like, at least from my perspective, a lot of the service issues has come from having the opposite type of investor, where you've had the very activist investor that's gone into railroads, particularly ones that have ORs that are worse than the peer group, push to get a new CEO. New CEO cuts lots of costs. Tells Wall Street they're using PSR, not PSR light, but full PSR, and ultimately that's caused them to not grow the volume, instead focus on the cost reduction. I would think that, at least from my perspective, that having longer term investors would lend itself to looking, needing a way to grow the volume, and recognizing that sort of quarter to quarter, the OR this quarter doesn't make that big of a difference, and there really does need to be an avenue for growth. But I do see what you're saying. If there's not a lot of if those investors are too close to the company and they are not receptive to other ideas, because you could have an activist investor who buys up a small portion of the shares. If they get those large voters on board with one thing or another, then all of a sudden, then it's not as concentrated of a position. But I do really appreciate the work that you did on that.
And the short-term investor is doing exactly what PSR did, right? So if you look at the railroads have laid off 30% of their workforce, everybody's heard that number. And so the railroads cut and changed too quickly to try to react to Wall Street. In general, though, we got to be really careful. Was that for the investors, or was for the guys that have stock options? Who benefits greatly from stock values going up? Wall Street? Absolutely. But everybody that has shares, stock options inside the railroad also benefits very highly from that. And having a look at who inside those railroads has that greatest, shall we say, win. So I just want to make sure that it's investors at Wall Street and yes, they're looking for a quick spike and a good growth in value of their shares, but there's also a lot of other beneficiaries inside the railroad that appreciate that happening.
Yeah, there's been plenty of incentive to lower the OR and grow earnings, and less incentive, I think, to provide excellent service and grow the volume, unfortunately, for a lot of the companies that you work very closely with, Herman. So that's really all the time we have, but thanks very much, Herman, for joining us today on PSR. Where can folks reach out to you?